underlying all of this discussion, we've been talking about the evangelicals and mainstream and the Catholics and liberation theology, but underlying a lot of this whole discussion is maybe a fundamental question, and that is, can you be a Christian? Is Christianity compatible with a free market economy or with capitalism? I mean, that seems to me maybe a foundational view. A lot of people think, well, if I'm a Christian, that I need to have a deep concern for the poor, and capitalism is kind of crass utilitarianism. And you look around, and obviously mercantilism and colonialism isn't going to be appealing to you, so you look around and you find structuralism in various forms, whether it's Marxism or something else, and there you have this shared concern for the poor. So, yeah, and let me just ask it, is capitalism contrary to Christianity, Sam?
No, it's not contrary to Christianity. The institutions that we commonly associate with the market economy, ranging from private property to free exchange, to rule of law, to the idea of human creativity, all these things I think are eminently compatible with Christianity because they reflect key aspects of Christian anthropology as a human person, graced with reason, with will, who's sinful and fallen, but nonetheless is capable of doing things, who's made as a co-creator, made in the image of God, is charged with the mandate of exercising dominion and stewardship over the earth. But also, so just theologically there's that dimension, but also institutionally. I think if you look at Christianity, it's responsible for refining and developing many of these institutions in a way that we now properly understand to them to be institutions of the free economy. Well, for example,
okay,
take
before
something like...
that, let me ask you, you said free economy and capitalism, are they different?
Well, capitalism, of course, is a Marxist word. I always like to remind Marxists of that, and because
all Marxists are capitalists.
No, it's not what I said. What I said was that capitalism was a Marxist word, and of course, therefore, it acquires all sorts of pejorative overtones, which we often associate with mythologies in many respects of the 19th century and industrial development and the Industrial Revolution. The free economy, I think, is the phrase that I use and many people at Acton use in preference, because I think it speaks more directly to what's really essential about this incredibly productive economic system that raises the wealth levels of everyone, gets everyone out of poverty in a remarkably quick period of time, but in a way that's conforming with human rights and human dignity and human responsibility. A lot of people who talk about capitalism, I think, often aren't so interested in substantive and thorough accounts of why we are free, where does freedom come from, what is freedom made up of, what does it look like, is it directed to anything at all? I think a lot of defenders of the free market fall into the trap of essentially adopting quasi-utilitarian explanations of markets and capitalism, and in that respect, by the way, they have very little difference between them and the views of Marxists when it comes to their understanding of the human person. It's almost exactly the same.
Okay, so let me ask you two questions.
Let me say this real quick, and I think I've seen a number of data points on various levels that capitalism's falling out of favor, or at least the use of the term. The term is under attack, and I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing, because if you have to start going back and thinking, well, what are the elements of this market economy or the free economy that we've been using capitalism as a shorthand for, but maybe it's been unexamined, and let's go back and look and see what the things are that make up what this positive view is. I think that's a good thing. So a lot of people are shying for various reasons away from using that word. Part of it's got to do with its origins and the pejorative things that go along with it, but
they don't know that capitalism means private property, rule of law, free association. They kind of think of it as an exploitative thing.
Well, also the word capitalism doesn't always capture the true institutional and human realities.
And this is what John Paul said in Centesimus Musalis, where he moved away from that term, right? I mean, because he said that term...
If you mean by capitalism, this.
Right. But also that term has this tension inherent between capital and labor. And it's a lot more of a like a dialectical term that's also I guess materialist. I guess.
Well, that's why it's human person. That's the Marxist roots of the term, right? I mean, because so it carries embedded with it, in a sense, the entire.
It also doesn't speak, I think, properly to the real driving force of market economies, which are human beings, human minds, human creativity, human entrepreneurship. When you hear the word capitalism, you don't think of those things. Those things don't jump to mind.
It's objectified. I mean, it's an objectifying term in the sense that you're focused on.
And proletariat and all that Marxist language.
So so I had two questions. One, let me ask the first one. You said, capitalism and market economies, we've kind of made that distinction. Let's talk about market economies. Market economies help get people out of poverty, and et cetera. And that's obviously true. I mean, the data, you can't, no matter what side of the political spectrum on, you can't say, no, free market economies make people poor. I mean, that's just obviously.
Unless you're Hugo Chavez.
Okay, but that's not the case. But we know, looking at the United States, looking at Western Europe, we know that those countries that have the highest levels of economic freedom are the wealthiest. So that's obvious. But there are a couple of arguments against it anyway. That one of them would say, well, great. Here you're talking about how capitalism and free market economies brought people out of poverty in an equitable way. But what about all the misery and suffering and of the laissez-faire Dickens image of people suffering and being exploited by landowners?
Charles Dickens has a lot to answer for, because if you go back and you look at the 19th century, and you look at the empirical data that's available when it comes to things like length of lifespan, material conditions of well-being, improved rates of health, when you see the onset of the Industrial Revolution, what you see is all these things massively start to increase, and in a very quick period of time and across the social classes. So that's empirical evidence of the material well-being that markets bring. Now, there's a caveat to this. And the caveat is that when you have increased prosperity, when you have increased economic well-being, you also have some cultural problems, some new cultural problems. Consumerism, materialism, because when there's lots of stuff around, it's very easy for all of us to fall into the trap of identifying ourselves in terms of what we own and what we possess. That's also possible, by the way, in a socialist economy, because when you lack things, the sheer lack of things means that you tend to attach more significance to material things than you otherwise should. Now, is this an argument against having market economies? As I suspect some people would actually say, yes, this is a reason why markets are bad. My response is always no. That's not an economic problem. That's a cultural and moral problem, and that's what the church should really be talking about. It has much more, I think, to say about these cultural phenomena and these cultural temptations, I think you can call them, of a prosperous market economy, and also the temptation of thinking in utilitarian things about everything. The church can speak to that in a way that really no other institution can speak to. Politicians certainly can't. They can't. Most of the intellectual class can't. But I think churches have a unique ability to talk about the place of the human person in the midst of material prosperity.
Yeah, that's right.